Okay, cool. Welcome to News for the Food Lover. My name is Dane Richards. I'm the publisher and chief judge at News for the Food Lover, and I've got the pleasure today of having Brian Steel and Jeremy Ryland with me. It's always good to catch up with these gentlemen, and with COVID, it's prevented that over the last year, but now things have eased up. We thought it's a great opportunity to talk about things that are happening in the food world, how COVID's affected the landscape, and talk about the art and craft of food criticism. So firstly, I'd like to speak to Brian. For a young person coming up looking to get into food reviewing or food critique, what would you, firstly tell us how you got into it?
So, look, I've always been passionate about food, and certainly through both reading, understanding, the history behind cuisines and linking to culture, and I've always been passionate about cooking. But restaurants was always, were always one of my happy places. And so I'd always aspired to be involved in the industry somehow. So almost to ratify or legitimize what I thought I already knew, I embarked on a journey of education, and I did at the time the master's degree in gastronomy with the Cordon Bleu. And when it came to thesis time, I got some great advice from one of the people who'd done the degree previously. And she said to me, look, when you choose your thesis, it's going to be a year of your life. You're going to make yourself an expert in something. And she said, and also don't do the usual academic thing and be a little bit too esoteric with your subject.
Yeah.
Like, try and make it a subject that A, you're really interested in, and B, someone else might be interested in terms of either seeking your advice and hopefully even paying you for that advice. So I thought that through, and I sat down and did mind maps and stuff, and I tried to come up with like a vision, a mission statement, if you will, going, if I write a thesis, what do I want? What do I want the outcome to be? And in the end, it was a really simple phrase. I want to get paid to eat. So my thesis...
Noble ambition.
No, exactly. I mean, I thought so. And so my thesis, therefore, was a study into the history of the restaurant, and then the influence of the media on restaurants on 21st century Sydney. But obviously, in order to get there, I had to understand the history of the restaurant, the history of the restaurant critic, and then come forward in time in a global context, and then look at Sydney specifically in terms of what's Sydney like when it comes to restaurants, because every city has their own gastronomic personality. And so, of course, excuse me, in writing that thesis and doing the research, I then had to interview a whole bunch of chefs across a broad demographic range, old, young, hatted and not hatted. And of course I reached out to all the editors and restaurant critics to interview them. So in the process of researching the thesis and writing the thesis, I built a network of people who, both chefs and media, who were all equally interested in the results of my thesis, and to all of whom I sent the thesis on completion. And then I sat back and waited, and eventually I started getting calls from organisations to become a judge, and from, for example, to then do reviewing for variously, for annual restaurant guides for Gourmet Traveller, Gomeo, and even to the point where I used to have a byline in the food service magazine called The Burning Issue, which allowed me to do more of the academic things that I enjoyed about the restaurant world. So there you go. That was the journey. So to answer your question, what would I say to someone who aspires to be in the industry? Well, I actually had this conversation with a young girl who was one of my students at the Cordon Bleu last year, who was doing advanced cuisine but also wanted to eventually progress to writing. And my advice is this: the most is understand what it actually is, which is you need to educate yourself to understand what it is about the restaurant that you are reviewing, and understand things like, it doesn't matter whether I like the food or not when I'm reviewing. You need to understand what, so things that irritate me is if I'm reading an article by any journalist linked to food, where they've eaten somewhere and they are complaining about things that are as they should be. So you need to understand. You need to understand history. You need to understand cuisine. You have to have an understanding of the physiology of taste. You have to understand human behaviour. You have to understand the basics about what a restaurant is, because it's more than just the food. So there's a lot involved, and it's not just, we laugh about it. We go, he's saying, yes, I wanted to get paid to eat. But also, you need to have a respect for an industry that suffers and works under the smallest margins and works harder than most people in any other industry for the least amount of reward, and dealing with the most chaotic part of the human condition, which is trying to make people happy when they might have had a bad day and they come to a restaurant and transference happens.
I was talking to a restaurant manager this week about it, and I said there's very few industries that within a short period of time you can change that whole person's perspective on that day. Absolutely. And it's via that as you said, transference and that joy of the industry, the love of the industry, and I don't know many professions that have that. But we'll talk a little bit more about the art and craft, and I'd like to also talk to you about a little bit about mentorship and leadership in food reviewing as well. But Jeremy, how can you tell us how you got into the industry? Because you've had a very long, distinguished career in food reviewing, in food media. So could you tell us how that started?
Well, I've worked in the food industry all my life. My first degree is in food science, so I'm a food scientist. I started in research with CSIRO many years ago, which I won't dictate. And like Brian, I have a passion for food, so I wanted to, I used to spend a lot of time in restaurants, and I learned enology and a whole lot of different disciplines. And eventually I did the same course as you did, the Masters in Gastronomy through Le Cordon Bleu. My thesis was on the difference between eating and dining, of which there is a significant difference. We eat to fuel ourselves, whereas we dine for entertainment. And I guess to get my first exposure to reviewing was back in the 80s when I was a member of the Food Media Club, which is sadly no longer there, but that was a group of food media people like Margaret Fulton, and we would get together about monthly and talk about food media issues and have a nice lunch, and basically that was it. But the idea is a little bit like Brian, of doing things where you can do something you really love and get paid for it too, although, reviewing you hardly get paid.
That's right. There's a little bit of misconception about that, isn't there?
No one's getting rich.
But so I think, look, food is something I've been involved in for a very long while, 40 odd years. And I guess as I'm getting towards the retirement age, the reviewing part of the life and the judging and that sort of thing is an easier opportunity than it is to be working full time in a factory.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, and just to summarise too, I think I agree with Brian on his thoughts, but for young people getting into reviewing, I think the biggest thing is knowledge of different things. If you're a music critic, you're usually someone who understands music. If you're a car critic, you know about cars and mechanics. If you're a food critic, you should understand food. You should be able to tell the difference between a mistake and a poor cooking. And you should also be able to describe food, not just, it tastes great. You should be able to give esoteric or evocative meaning to the reviews as well. So you do need an element of knowledge, and I think the best reviewers are people who've worked in the industry or are absolutely passionate about it for a long time.
Now in recent months,